John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in opposition to Bill C-51 and Anti-Terrorism Act 2015. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, terrorism is a real threat. It cannot be denied, a reality of life even here in Canada. And public safety has to be, must be a top priority of government. There is no debate on that point either, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, and this is what the whole debate comes down to in its simplest form, summed up in a quote from the leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada, the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition that I repeat often. The quote is this, Mr. Speaker: "You cannot protect freedoms by sacrificing those freedoms." Absolutely. You cannot protect sacred Canadian freedoms by sacrificing those sacred Canadian freedoms. This bill, Mr. Speaker, will give more power to the government agencies responsible for protecting Canadians. But it will give that power without increased oversight, unchecked power, Mr. Speaker. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a threat to freedom. Mr. Speaker, I was a journalist in my previous life, a newspaper man. I like to say that if you cut me, I would bleed ink. These days, Mr. Speaker, I'd probably bleed a radio clip. I savored the freedom I had as a journalist and a columnist, Mr. Speaker, to go where the story took me, to write what needed to be written, to say what needed to be said. I wasn't in the business for the money, Mr. Speaker, that's for sure. That's not what drove me, Mr. Speaker. In the mid-2000s, I was editor-in-chief of a weekly newspaper called The Independent. My last task every week, after the rest of the paper had been edited and put to bed, was to write my own column, an opinion piece called The Fighting Newfoundlander. But before I wrote that column, Mr. Speaker, I would ask myself one simple question, just one question, and it was this, Mr. Speaker: what am I afraid to say? And then, Mr. Speaker, I'd say it. I'd write it. I miss that freedom as a member of Parliament, Mr. Speaker. There is no freedom I hold in higher regard. But I savor freedom in general, Mr. Speaker. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, the people I represent in St. John's South Mount Pearl, and all Canadians shouldn't have to choose between their security and their rights, their security and their freedom. That is the Prime Minister's false choice, Mr. Speaker, and it is false, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister goes too far in putting politics ahead of principle, in putting fear ahead of freedom. Mr. Speaker, I want to return for a moment to October 22nd, 2014. It was my oldest son's 19th birthday, Mr. Speaker. It was also the day of the shootings on Parliament Hill. I remember speaking to my son on a telephone from a safe room in the East Block after the gunfire in Centre Block, and we had been evacuated from the caucus room. I remember telling my son, Mr. Speaker, that I was safe. Everybody around me was alive, and happy birthday. I remember, Mr. Speaker, what I call my foxhole moment, lying on the floor of the caucus room, hiding behind an overturned table and locking eyes with Glenn Thibeault. Now, he was the then Member of Parliament for Sudbury. Like everyone else around us, Mr. Speaker, we didn't know what was happening. We knew that there was gunfire just outside the door. I imagine, Mr. Speaker, Glenn Thibeault saw in my eyes what I saw in his eyes: terror, fear of being shot, fear of being killed. That's what I mean by my foxhole moment, Mr. Speaker. My foxhole moment in, of all places, the Parliament of Canada. The next day, Mr. Speaker, Parliament resumed sitting, and I was proud. I could not be prouder of the way the country responded in the wake of such terror, such tragedy. All leaders spoke in this House, Mr. Speaker. All leaders embraced. The nation embraced with them, Mr. Speaker. And the Prime Minister made a statement that I have repeated often, that in our system, in our country, we are opponents, but we are never enemies. Mr. Speaker, in this House, we are united by the desire to better our country. As opponents, we disagree on how to get there, but we all strive for a better Canada, a better Newfoundland and Labrador. I'd like to think that anyway, Mr. Speaker. We are opponents, but we are never enemies. But the Prime Minister said something else immediately after the October 22nd attack on Parliament Hill. The Prime Minister gave a statement that I thought foreshadowed where we are today, Mr. Speaker, why I have such reservations about this bill. The Prime Minister called the shooter a terrorist, and he described the terrible event as a terrorist attack. In fact, the Prime Minister said in a statement, "This will lead us to strengthen our resolve and redouble our efforts and those of our national security agencies to take all necessary steps to identify and counter threats and keep Canada safe here at home." All necessary steps, Mr. Speaker. But this bill, Mr. Speaker, is a step too far. It was almost like this government was looking for an excuse to proceed with its agenda, and it found an excuse in the October 22nd shooting. Bill C-51 will allow all federal departments and agencies to share information that may be relevant to national security, information not just on terrorist attacks, Mr. Speaker, and to share that information with the Canadian intelligence and law enforcement agencies. But, Mr. Speaker, C-51 still compromises the basic principle of privacy rights in Canada. And that basic principle is this, that information should only be used for the purpose for which it was collected. Now, although CSIS, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, our spy agency, and the RCMP are governed by the Privacy Act in their collection, use, and disclosure of personal information, Mr. Speaker, many of the departments and agencies that would now be allowed to share information with them are not covered by these laws. The Privacy Commissioner is concerned that this bill will allow for many law-abiding Canadians, like most of us are, Mr. Speaker, to have their information collected and shared with law enforcement without reasonable cause, and will potentially allow the government to build personal profiles on each and every one of us, Mr. Speaker, on each and every one of us. And, Mr. Speaker, an even bigger concern is who exactly will keep an eye on who's keeping an eye on us. This bill, Bill C-51, will give CSIS greater powers, Mr. Speaker, but will not correspondingly expand oversight at CSIS. And without proper oversight, the door is wide open for abuse. The abuse of our freedoms, Mr. Speaker, our basic Canadian freedoms. Now, on top of the lack of oversight, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government continues to cut the budgets of those agencies on the front line against terrorist threats, including the RCMP, including CSIS. They've both had their budget cuts each year starting in 2012. The RCMP has seen its spending decrease by $420 million between 2009 and 2014. The budget at CSIS was cut by $44 million between 2012 and 2013. This government, Mr. Speaker, has cut the tools it already had to fight terrorism. And now they're increasing the scope of CSIS, but providing no further oversight in the process. Now, questions have also been raised about this bill in respect to the question of what constitutes a threat to the security of Canada, especially with the terms being so broad and the oversight so inadequate. There are concerns that under this legislation, Mr. Speaker, environmental or First Nation groups that set up a picket line or blockade could be interrupted by CSIS. Experts warn, Mr. Speaker, that legitimate dissent could be lumped in with terrorism. And that's not very Canadian, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely un-Canadian. It may be conservative, but it's not Canadian. Questions have been raised too, Mr. Speaker, about how journalists, satirists, artists, and others who report on or mock statements about terrorism may be impacted by this bill. Could there come a day, Mr. Speaker, when a columnist asks herself, what am I afraid to write? What am I afraid to write? And then make sure he doesn't. He doesn't write what he's afraid to write. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, people willing to trade their freedom for security deserve neither and will lose both. We must not allow that to happen, Mr. Speaker. Our Canadian freedoms are not for trade, Mr. Speaker. This Conservative government has forgotten that, which is why it has to go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened with interest to the honourable member's speech. He spoke much about terrorists and satirists, and I wonder perhaps if he may be a satirist himself. I noticed that he commented that he was amazed to hear the Prime Minister say that the October 22nd incident was not a terrorist attack. Well, I guess I have three questions for him. Was he in the opposition lobby or room on October 22nd? Did he see the bullet holes which are left in the door of that same room? And if this was not a terrorist attack on October 22nd, exactly what was it?
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was in this place on October 22nd when the attack occurred. I was in the caucus room, down the Hall of Honor, right across from the Conservative caucus room. I've had many tours. I brought many people from St. John South Mount Pearl for tours of the riding, from the riding for tours of Parliament since then. What everybody wants to see is the bullet holes. The bullet hole in the door to the Library of Parliament. The bullet that went right through the door to our caucus room, Mr. Speaker, that lodged in the soundproofing cushion door on the inside. People want to see that. Have I seen the bullet holes? I've seen the bullet holes. Was that a terrorist attack, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister made the statement he made a statement on the night of the shooting, and he called this man a terrorist. He called this a terrorist attack. But as far as anybody knew right then, Mr. Speaker, this was a deranged individual, an individual with problems. And the red flags went off in my mind immediately because it was immediately branded as a terrorist attack. We didn't know that, Mr. Speaker. From my perspective, it was the Conservative government using this for their own agenda. And their own agenda is what we have in front of us today, Mr. Speaker. It's Bill C-51.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, and my question's in regards to a major aspect of the member's comments in regards to oversight. The government seems to want to give the impression to Canadians that oversight is being provided through our judicial system. And yet we have other nations, in particular the Five Eyes nations, which Canada is a part of, where as opposed to judicial oversight, it is parliamentary oversight, something that we have been advocating from within the Liberal Party. And I'm wondering if the member might want to comment in regards to why it's important that Canada have parliamentary oversight as opposed to the judicial oversight model in which this government seems to be proposing.
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Parliamentary oversight. What is parliamentary oversight? I guess that is the ability of parliamentarians to provide oversight on bills. I see so many examples, Mr. Speaker, of how this Prime Minister and this government has complete contempt for Parliament, complete contempt for parliamentarians, be it the number of times they've introduced closure or time allocation on a bill. I understand, Mr. Speaker, it's the most in history for time allocation, 100 times more than any other government in history. This government, Mr. Speaker, all it has is contempt. And nothing comes sooner, Mr. Speaker, than October 19th and Election Day when we get rid of this majority Conservative government. Parliamentary oversight. What's that?
Time for a quick question. The honourable member for Hamilton East Stony Creek.
I just want to thank the member from St. John's Mount Pearl. In a sense, the bullets that were fired in this place have gone through the heart of our very charter. The reality of the damage that is being done here, this shooter has succeeded. His attack on Parliament was meant to diminish this Parliament, to diminish the value of this Parliament, and by putting this law into place, that's exactly what we're doing.
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question, and he just made a statement that I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I will repeat. The bullets fired in this place went right through the very heart of this charter. They went through doors. They were lodged, bullets lodged in walls. But the damage done that day, done to this Parliament, and that we see again manifest itself in this bill, Bill C-51, it's unforgivable, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate.